great questions and discussion points. You can tackle those now, Brian, if you don't mind.
Yeah, look, fantastic questions and fantastic discussion. Let me try and deal with part of the last two contributions first, because there was a rising tide of struggle in the 1960s, and that's indicative of something general under capitalism, which is that there is always class struggle. As we argue, sometimes hidden, sometimes open, but there is all, where there are, classes, there is class struggle, and under capitalism, that is as much the case as under, pre-capitalist class societies, and it certainly was the case in the 1960s that there was a rising tide of struggle, symbolised, of course, by the civil rights movement and the great marches and demonstrations that King had led. And the Panthers were the follow-up. And in fact, arguably, it wasn't that the struggle waned. It's that, that after, if you like, the high point of the civil rights movement, I think that the struggle both deepened, broadened, it became a deeper struggle rather than just about civil rights. And it broadened, so it wasn't simply a Southern-based movement, as King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference had been. It became a much more, nationwide movement, and it became more militant. It morphed from being a civil rights movement to being a Black Power movement, and the Panthers emerged onto the scene as part of that struggle. Now, one of our arguments as a revolutionary party is that, yes, struggle is sometimes hidden, sometimes open, but that you need conscious revolutionary leadership to try and shape and direct that struggle and to ensure that it doesn't go down to defeat but can lead to victories and ultimately revolution. So, Lenin created the Bolshevik Party. Lenin and others created a party and built and developed a party to intervene in the struggles in Russia and encouraged an international movement, a communist international, and so on. And we would argue that it's important to build a revolutionary parties today in order to intervene in the struggles of today. And and that was the case in the 60s. And actually here, I want to both agree with and slightly disagree with what Keith said, because yes, selling the Little Red Book was a way of making money so they could buy guns. Actually, it was partly indicative of the politics that the Panthers had. They took theory very seriously, and indeed read Black Against Empire, and it highlights the fact that, professional Panthers, once they had done, their duties, the breakfast clubs and so on, they were required to study theory. They studied Marx, they studied Lenin and so on. The issue, however, was actually the theory that they developed was a theory that was to a large extent based upon the distortion of Marxism that Maoism represented. The idea of focusing not on the working class, the organised working class in workplaces, trade unions and so on, but working on, the lumpen proletariat was based upon a kind of voluntaristic idea that you could substitute a vanguard. The vanguard party would in a sense, separate itself off from the people and be servants of the people, delivering and doing things on behalf of the people. So I think there was a theoretical weakness to the Panthers that was at the heart of the problem. Having said all of that, and I think, you can understand in a society as deeply segregated as America was, as it still is, why it is that you think that your focus has to be primarily, if not exclusively, upon Black people and organising Black people. That's understandable. It's also understandable, Rob's right to highlight the fact you could have a huge amount of sympathy for the community programs. The community programs saved lives. They gave people an education. They delivered real, tangible things to people. It's understandable that, people admired them for those things. They were good things. The question is, are they the things that a revolutionary party aimed at building a vanguard party, organising the most militant sections of workers? Is that the activity that a revolutionary party should be focusing on? And that was one of the areas where difficulties arose within the Panthers, and there were real tensions in the party about this. The name that I forgot is David Hilliard. It was David Hilliard who was more committed to the idea of the servant staff, the community programs, than the patrolling the police side of things, who promoted that particular agenda to a much greater extent, whilst Steele, whilst Newton, whilst Cleaver were either in prison or in exile. So there were political tensions as well, political arguments, theoretical arguments that led to practical differences that underscored the way in which the Panthers operate. In answer to the question, did the Panthers change or the system, or did the system change the Panthers? Look, as I say, there was always that tension between the different programs there, and the fact that increasingly the community programs became more prominent, you could argue, meant that the system was changing the Panthers. I think the reality is that the fact that the state wiped them out. I don't think it was a fundamental change in the Panthers' politics. I think that ultimately, because the state has more power, has access to more weaponry, could mobilise more people, could mobilise the huge resources through the counterintelligence programme, they butchered and wiped the Panthers out. And we should never forget that. We should never forget that that's the primary reason that the Panthers were destroyed. But it does, of course, it highlights a political arguably a political weakness if the primary central focus of the organisation is armed self-defence. Our argument is that for a revolutionary party, a better way of doing things is to seek to organise the working class where the working class is most powerful and has the most potential to bring the system crashing to its knees, and that is in the workplaces and in working communities. And yes, it was the case that the Panthers did have discussions with other groups and so on, but it was limited, and it was only actually afterwards and through there were other later organisations that were part of that broader Black Power movement later on in the 1960s, organisations like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and so on, who did in the first instance try to organise black workers, but then also have discussions with white workers and talk about collective united working class action as well. So, I think all of those were factors in the demise of the Panthers. And as I say, we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the size, the strength, the sustained nature, the elan and the determination of that whole civil rights and Black Power movement made real change happen. It wasn't just for nothing, it made real change happen. The fact that, subsequently you have black police chiefs, district attorneys, elected officials, a black middle class developing, all of that came out of the struggles of the 1960s that these movements and these individuals and organisations fought so courageously for. However, what they fought so courageously for, but they didn't fight just for that, did they? They didn't fight just to have a few black faces in high places or to enable a minority to rise to the top and then pull the ladder up to prevent others from rising. They fought for, they wanted to achieve the liberation of all people, and that is a challenge that still faces us today. The United Nations, the first question that came up, the reality, the United Nations was never fit for purpose. It was always established as part of the post-war settlement to establish a rules-based order that served the interests of the most powerful capitalist countries. And the fact that that you have a United Nations Security Council that includes Russia, China, United States, Britain, and so on, that embedded within it was the domination and the rule by these capitalist and imperialist powers, and within the Security Council and so on. It was already, by the time the Panthers were drawing up their program, it was already the case that the United Nations was implicated in some terrible atrocities, and certainly the countries that made up the key organisation, the key countries, the Security Council within the United Nations, had committed terrible atrocities and continued to do so, and have continued to do so right up to the present day. The United Nations may not have revealed itself quite as much then, but as we know now, it certainly revealed itself to be an utterly bankrupt organisation in terms of delivering real freedom and equality to the masses. And yes, of course, there are, in terms of state repression, of course there are parallels with today. The suppression of Palestine action, the appalling situation now where supporters of Palestine action are being dragged in their hundreds from Trafalgar Square and criminalised. Of course, it doesn't compare immediately with the police massacring Panthers off the streets and so on, but it is a sign of the steps that the state is prepared to take to silence opposition, and therefore we can have no illusion that there's something progressive about capitalist states that can be changed through reform or through appeals to them. The only way forward is revolutionary transformation. The Panthers were revolutionaries. They were revolutionaries of their time. They had weaknesses which in some senses are indicative of the weaknesses of organisations of the 1960s, with a commitment to some of the political ideas that were very current and dominant in the 1960s. Many of those ideas are dead in the water now. The challenge for us is to argue that a way forward. It was the case, to come back and hopefully finish on this. The United States remains an incredibly segregated country. But even in the 1960s, it was the case that there was potential for greater black and white unity. We saw it in some of the marches of the civil rights movement. We saw it in the development of the anti-war movement in the late 1960s. We saw it in the gay liberation struggles coming out of Stonewall. And actually, Leslie, before I finish, one point I should make is this, is that on the question of gay liberation, the Panthers were incredibly progressive. Huey P. Newton spoke frequently about the gay liberation movement and how their struggle was also the struggle that the Panthers should be involved in and support, with the struggle of black people, because they understood that where oppression attacked people, it attacked one group, it could weaken others and attack them as well. Yes, we should take great inspiration from the determination, the elan, the courage of the Panthers. But as I say, we want to stand on the shoulders of such giants in order to see further and more clearly, and with a stronger theoretical and organisational depth to it. And that's why, we want to admire the Panthers, but not uncritically so.
Thanks ever so much, Brian. And